Hey guys!
It's Jaya.
And Sammy.
And we're the
Macro Majesties!
Today we're learning about loanable funds.
The loanable funds market is a financial market that brings together people who want to lend money, lenders, and people who want to borrow money, borrowers. The relationship between the quantity of loanable funds demanded by borrowers and the quantity of loanable funds supplied by lenders in this market is depicted by the loanable funds market graph. On this graph, the x-axis is labeled Q of LF, which stands for quantity of loanable funds, and the y-axis is labeled real interest rate, which is the interest rate adjusted for inflation. The graph consists of two curves, the loanable funds supply curve, labeled SLF, and the loanable funds demand curve, labeled DLF. The loanable funds supply curve shows the relationship between the quantity of loanable funds supplied and the real interest rate. This curve slopes upward, showing a positive relationship, which means when the quantity of loanable funds supplied increases, the real interest rate increases, and when the quantity of loanable funds supplied decreases, the real interest rate decreases. The loanable funds demand curve shows the relationship between the quantity of loanable funds demanded and the real interest rate. This curve slopes downward, showing a negative relationship, which means when the quantity of loanable funds demanded decreases, the real interest rate increases, and when the quantity of loanable funds demanded increases, the real interest rate decreases. The two curves intersect when the quantity of loanable funds demanded equals the quantity of loanable funds supplied, indicating that the market is at equilibrium. Now let's look at what happens to the graph when the curve shifts.
The loanable funds market is always changing, and this is caused by a shift in the supply curve or a shift in the demand curve for loanable funds. For example, the supply curve shifts to the right when there's an increase in supply. This causes a new equilibrium point, and at this point, there's an increase in the quantity of loanable funds and a decrease in the real interest rate. So let's do the same thing, except this time the supply decreases, shifting the supply curve to the left. This causes a new equilibrium point right here. And at this point, there is a decrease in the quantity of loanable funds and an increase in the real interest rate. So that's supply. Now let's look at demand. So the demand curve shifts to the left when there's a decrease in demand. Right here is where the new equilibrium point is, and at this point, there's a decrease in the quantity of loanable funds and a decrease in the real interest rate as well. Lastly, let's look at a rightward shift of the demand curve. At this new equilibrium point, there is an increase in the quantity of loanable funds demanded and an increase in the real interest rate. I know what you're thinking. What causes these shifts? There are certain shifters or events that cause changes in the curve for both supply and demand of loanable funds. Let's look at the shifters for supply first. There are two things that can cause a shift in the supply curve. First is private savings behavior, and there's a lot of reasons for private savings behavior to increase or decrease. For example, when private citizens generally feel richer, they're willing to spend more, meaning they save less. Because they are saving less, there's a decrease in the supply of loanable funds, and the supply curve shifts to the left. If private citizens are saving more, on the other hand, there is an increase in the supply of loanable funds, and the supply curve shifts to the right. The other cause for a shift in the supply curve is changes in the flow of capital. When there's capital inflows, meaning money is being invested into a country, supply increases and the supply curve shifts to the right. When there's capital outflows, meaning money is going out of the country, supply decreases and the supply curve shifts to the left. The shifters of supply can easily be remembered with this acronym. SAMMY, hey look, that's me, is outstanding. Savings, inflows, outflows. So next, let's look at the shifters for demand. There are two things that can shift the demand curve. First is perceived business opportunities, and that can be broken into two main parts. The first part is business investment. When businesses believe they can get a high rate of return on their investments, they demand more loanable funds to pay for those investments, shifting the demand curve to the right. On the other hand, when businesses believe they will get a low rate of return on their investments, they demand less loanable funds to pay for those investments, shifting the demand curve to the left. The second part of business opportunities is investment tax credits, which incentivizes businesses to invest by allowing them to deduct a certain amount of money from their taxes. For example, if the government wanted to support renewable energy, the government would issue an investment tax credit for it, and as a result, businesses would want to invest more because it increases their overall rate of return on their investments. This causes an increase in demand for loanable funds, shifting the demand curve to the right. The last shifter of the demand curve is changes in the government's borrowing, but it gets a little more complicated from here. Hey Jaya, can you explain it?
Yeah, of course. A government budget deficit is when the government spends more money than it takes in as taxes. The government funds deficit spending with loans from the loanable funds market. As the government increases its borrowing to cover the deficit, the demand for loanable funds in the market increases, shifting the demand curve to the right. This shift increases the equilibrium quantity of loanable funds and the equilibrium interest rate. Increased interest rates discourage investment, so the government increasing its borrowing crowds out other investors from the market. This situation is called crowding out.
The shifters of demand can be remembered with this acronym: the idiotic GOAT. Tax credit, investment, government borrowing.
Another factor that affects the loanable funds market graph is expected real interest rates because lenders and borrowers base their decisions about loanable funds on these expectations. If inflation is expected to increase, the nominal interest rate or the interest rate before it's adjusted for inflation will also increase, so lenders still make a profit. Say, for example, a borrower borrows $100 at an interest rate of 10% from a lender to be paid back in 1 year. During that year, there was a 10% increase in inflation, which decreased the value of money. Because of this inflation, something that cost $100 at the beginning of the year now costs $110. This causes the lender to not make a profit because when the borrower pays the lender $110 at the end of the year, that $110 is worth the same amount as $100 at the beginning of the year due to inflation. To prevent this from happening, lenders take expected inflation into consideration when establishing nominal interest rates. The real interest rate equals the nominal interest rate minus the inflation rate. So if the nominal interest rate increases, real interest rate will also increase. This idea is called the Fisher effect.
Do you know what time it is?
No, what time is it?
Pop quiz time!
The first question is, which of the following will increase the demand for loanable funds? Pause the video to answer the question. The answer is A, an investment tax credit. This is because an investment tax credit would incentivize businesses to invest because it increases their rate of return. Because businesses invest more, it increases the demand for loanable funds.
Question 2. Which of the following will cause a decrease in the supply for loanable funds? The answer is C, because when money is flowing out of the country's economy, there is less funds available to loan, meaning the supply of loanable funds decreases.
Question 3. Which of the following best describes crowding out? The answer is E, the negative effect that government budget deficits have on investment spending. The answer is E because a budget deficit causes the government to increase its borrowing, which increases the demand for loanable funds in the market. This increase in demand shifts the demand curve to the right, which increases the interest rate. An increased interest rate discourages investors from investing, decreasing investment spending.
Thanks for watching!
See you next time on
Macro Majesties.